Hello, my friends. Welcome to, or back to, the Dennis Prager Show. There's an article that is actually, it's probably going, at least as terms of articles go, sort of viral. And it ought to, in fact, and that's why I'm having the gentleman on. He's a former Associated Press correspondent. Exactly what his role was, I'm going to establish with him in a moment. We're putting the story up at dennisprager.com. And it is titled, An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. By the way, most important story on Earth is precisely his point. It's not the most important story on Earth, but it's covered as if it is, and that is Israel. A former AP correspondent explains how and why reporters get Israel so wrong and why it matters. His name is Matti Friedman. And Mr. Friedman, welcome to the Dennis Prager Show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Where are you located right now?
In Jerusalem.
Were you the head of the Associated Press Jerusalem Bureau?
No. I was a reporter and an editor on the news desk in Jerusalem between 2006 and 2011 for about 5.5 years.
So 5.5 years you worked for AP in the Middle East?
Correct.
Okay, I wanted me to get that straight. I thought I had, for some reason, read in your long piece, but I read it at 1 in the morning, and I may have...
I was not the bureau chief, and let's just say that I'm not likely to become the bureau chief after today.
That's correct. Well, right, after this article, that is correct. I think that's clear. I'd like to, since it's such a huge issue, what I'd like to do is read to you parts of what you wrote and have you comment, okay?
Sounds good.
The point of Matti Friedman's piece, as former AP reporter, there are a number of points, but one is, but at least people need to ask the question, why is there so much coverage of everything that Israel is involved with? And why is there so much hypercriticism of Israel? In the first hour, I cited some of the data that you report, but here's one from the beginning of your article. A representative article from a recent issue of the New Yorker described the summer's events by dedicating one sentence each. Again, this is about the summer's events in the New Yorker. One sentence each to the horrors in Nigeria and Ukraine, 4 sentences to the crazed genocidaires of ISIS, and the rest of the article, 30 sentences to Israel and Gaza. This is a sort of a flagship example for you. Is that correct?
That's right. I think it pretty much reflects Western media coverage over the past 2 months.
Yeah, and your question is the question. Why so much attention to Israel? And I cited in the first hour your data. You did a survey of how many negative stories by AP on Israel inside of, I think, 7 weeks. And then it took 3 years to get the equivalent number of negative stories about the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian society, even though one is a free society and one is not a free society. Is that another fair point that I'm summarizing?
Certainly. Right before the time I left the AP at the end of 2007, more as a lark than anything, I started counting negative stories about Israeli society that were coming out of the Bureau. And I counted 27 within 7 weeks, and I give the dates in the story, which works out to an average of 1 negative story every 2 days. And just taking a very conservative estimate, I wasn't counting negative stories about the Palestinians, but I think I'm being very, very conservative when I say that the AP did not run 27 negative stories about Palestinian society in the preceding 3 years, including about the totalitarian Islamists of Hamas.
And do you remember offhand what you wrote about how many reporters are stationed in Israel versus other places in the world?
Absolutely. During the years that I was at the AP had more than 40 news staffers covering Israel and the Palestinians. That's about 12 million people. And that was more reporters than the AP had in China, 1.3 billion people. It was more than they had in all 50 countries in sub-Saharan Africa combined. It was more news staff than they had covering all of the countries where the uprisings of the so-called Arab Spring eventually erupted combined. It was, as far as the AP was concerned and as far as the international media in general is concerned, the most important story on earth.
Well, that, of course, brings up the 64,000 shekel question, and that is your theory is...
That's not that much money, by the way, but yes.
Yeah, all right, it's a bad one. I'll up it next time. The 10 million shekel question.
That's more like it, yeah.
Why is this in your view? Or before you give, because that's really the punchline of your piece, but before that, I just want to know, when you were working for the Associated Press, were you aware of this?
I went into the AP and to international media in general pretty naive and very optimistic. I was really looking forward to getting a chance as an Israeli reporter to escape the echo chamber of my own side and to see this place, this very complicated and interesting place where I live, from the bird's eye view, and to work alongside Palestinians, which I very much enjoyed, by the way. And I left very, very disillusioned. So the things that I wrote in the piece that was published yesterday are things that I learned over my nearly 6 years at the AP. They weren't things that I knew going in.
How are you surprised by the reaction, or I should say the attention to your story?
Yes. To be honest, the story was published yesterday morning. As of about an hour ago, it's been shared 35,000 times on Facebook. I know, as someone who's been covering this story for many, many years, for my entire adult life, really, I know that people are very interested in it, but I've never seen interest quite of this ferocity. I think it has a lot to do with the intensity of media coverage over the past few months and the way a lot of people who might be sympathetic to Israel have felt viewing the coverage that's been coming out of Israel. And I think for a lot of people, it's been, the article kind of came as a relief, a confirmation of something that people had suspected, and as kind of an explanation of why the picture that we've been seeing is as warped as it is.
Yeah, I have to say that in a lifetime of watching warped reporting, I think that this case is the most egregious.
I agree. I think that with every round, certainly over the past 14 years, since the beginning of what's known as the Second Intifada in 2000, with each progressive round, it gets worse. And with each progressive round, Israel's standing in the international media and in the international community takes another hit. So, this is not the first round of fighting. It's not the first round of Gaza fighting. And I think that as far as press coverage and as far as international criticism is concerned, this is the worst one yet. And if there's another one in 2 years, it will be even worse. Okay,
so here's part of my question of you regarding your overall explanation. Do you think it emanates from the left-wing tilt of the international media, or do you think it emanates from something even deeper than that?
I think that, and I would put myself there if I had a gun to my head and I was forced to identify myself politically. I think that, unfortunately, on the left, Israel has come to be seen as a symbol of everything that's wrong on earth. And large swaths of the left have become far less concerned with protecting working people or ensuring positive government intervention on behalf of the weaker elements in society to an unhealthy and very hostile obsession with Israel. Of course, we haven't seen any mass protests in America or Europe in favor of the working man and against exploitation of working people, which are the classic causes of the left. And we've seen this summer many tremendously large demonstrations against Israel. So this has really become the symbolic cause of the left. And in light of that,
let me ask you a personal question,
sure,
and you could,
sure.
Even though you're Israeli, but you could still plead the fifth, as we say in America. I asked this of Alan Dershowitz. We've had 3 public dialogue debates, and he defends Israel, and he's on the left. And I ask him, and we'll take a break before you answer, does this ever cause you to rethink your leftness? This moral breakdown on one of the fundamental issues of the world, that the left is so wrong on something so morally obvious. We'll be back in a moment. This is a very important interview with a very important writing of this man, Matti Friedman, who for 6 years was with the Associated Press. The article is up at my website. We'll be back in a moment. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Dennis Prager, a former Associated Press reporter, about 6-7 years in the Middle East. Has, in effect, spilled the beans on reporting in general and the Associated Press specifically with regard to the Middle East. And it's a very sobering piece. It is up at DennisPrager.com, an insider's guide to the most important story on earth. A former AP correspondent explains how and why reporters get Israel so wrong and why it matters. And I respectfully and truly respectfully asked Mr. Friedman right before the break what I asked Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard law professor, who is a man of the left, but who understands that the greatest hatred of Israel today emanates from that very left, and understands how morally obtuse that is. Does this ever make the person rethink his commitment to the left? Since it's my belief that virtually everything the left touches, it ruins. So that's my challenge to you, and it's not to be provocative. I'm truly curious.
I can't imagine I'd have anything as smart to say as Alan Dershowitz, but I've never quite understood the connection between the left and hostility to Israel. It certainly exists. I mean, the existence is a fact. The leftness that I grew up with, which I inherited, I guess, mostly from my father, who was a child of two garment district workers from New York who moved to America with that great wave of immigration from Eastern Europe and were saved, as they saw it, by the unions and by the Democratic Party. And always had the idea that government has a positive role to play in protecting working people and improving the lives of the weaker elements of society. And certainly when I view the world today, when I'm looking for smart people to explain to me what is going on Earth, I find myself more and more, and I think a lot of people are in this in the same boat as the left has become more and more ideological and I think less and less in touch with the way the world actually works. I find myself more and more looking to voices that happen to be conservative. Maybe it's no coincidence. Guys like Mike Doran, I find extremely insightful, the former Bush advisor. I find myself getting my news more and more from places like the Wall Street Journal and less from places like the New York Times. Is that coincidence? Probably not. It's possible that as I get older, I'm not that old, I'm 36, but as I spend more and more time in the Middle East, I've been here since I was 17, which is almost half of my life, you kind of come to appreciate values which I guess might be called conservative, a kind of instinctive loyalty to friends, which I think is an underappreciated value that we're seeing now play out in the Middle East in terms of America's relationships with its allies, a certain willingness to stand up for what you believe in and not apologize about it. I think these elements are leading me and many others, like Professor Dershowitz, who would still identify with the left, toward more and more sympathy with conservative voices and ideas.
Well, welcome. You began your answer with you can't quite get your hand on why the left would be associated with anti-Israel, but the left in my lifetime, which is longer than yours, has always been associated with the wrong causes internationally. They hated anti-communists. They weren't pro-Soviet, but they hated the anti-Soviets. When Ronald Reagan said the Soviet Union was an evil empire, which should have elicited a yawn, he was pilloried by the New York Times. New York Times is a moral cesspool, and it has been on every major moral issue of my lifetime. And so I just want you to know that, we're not living with the garment workers of the 30s.
Yes, in some ways that's unfortunate. I would certainly on the point specifically of Israel, I would agree. I think that the media associated with liberal America has gotten it incredibly and tragically wrong, and that one of the casualties, which is, I think, quite evident and is probably going to get worse before it gets better, is America's standing in this part of the world and in most parts of the world.
So you write in asking your question. I want you to. I want to read this. It's very powerful. It's a very powerful piece you wrote. The world's only Jewish country. It's on page 5 of 6, and I have small print. The world's only country. The world's only Jewish country has done less harm than most countries on earth, and more good. And yet when people went looking for a country that would symbolize the sins of our new post-colonial, post-militaristic, post-ethnic dream world, the country they chose was this one. When the people responsible for explaining the world to the world, journalists, cover the Jews' war as more worthy of attention than any other, when they portray the Jews of Israel as the party obviously in the wrong, when they omit all possible justifications for the Jews' actions and obscure the true face of their enemies, what they are saying to their readers, whether they intend to or not, is that Jews are the worst people on earth. The Jews are a symbol of the evils that civilized people are taught from an early age to abhor. International press coverage has become a morality play starring a familiar villain. And then you write in really, I guess bitter even, Israel is the pool into which the world spits. So, what's your explanation?
I think that there are very deep thought patterns in what I guess we can call generally Western society. And these thought patterns can recede and they can disguise themselves as something else, but they don't go away. Very deep ways of seeing the world don't disappear. And one of the most fundamental aspects of Western civilization, unfortunately, has been a hostile obsession with Jews and the idea of the moral failure of Jews. And if you look at Christian societies over the centuries, Jews were a lightning rod for negative sentiment in these societies. They were a blank screen onto which you projected the things you hated about yourself and about your own society. So if you wanted to condemn people for being greedy, let's say you wanted to condemn greed, the Jews were greedy. And if you wanted to condemn cowardice, you'd say that the Jews are cowards. And much later, if you were a capitalist and you wanted to condemn communism, you'd say the Jews are communists, which we saw in America in the 50s. And if you were a communist and you wanted to condemn capitalists, you would say that Jews are bankers. So the Jews, because they were this transnational minority, were a very handy blank screen onto which you project negative characteristics. And what happens is in the 40s, this all gets taken a bit too far. Unacceptable. It becomes very unfashionable.
Well, that's what we would have hoped. All right, I'm going to take some calls. We'll have a final segment with Matti Friedman when we come back. 1-8-PRAGER-776. Hi, everybody. A final segment here with Matti Friedman, the 7 years editor and reporter for the Associated Press in the Middle East. He's right now in Jerusalem. And he's written a very important piece, and it is up at my website, DennisPrager.com, and it is my pleasure. He did not ask me to mention this, although he had a perfect right to. But he did. He has a terrific nonfiction thriller published called The Aleppo Codex. It's as nonfiction implies, it is a true story, but it is a thriller. And for those of you interested in true thrillers or in the Bible or anything like that, or the Middle East, it's excellent and recommended, and that too we're putting up. It is read by the Living Martyr. The Living Martyr has read it, and in fact he was. I could not get in touch with him during the period of time he was reading the book. His wife could not get in touch with him. That is how preoccupied. That is quite an achievement. Actually, really is. The Aleppo Codex. So I'm happy to mention that, Matti. And let's try to get a call or two in before we say goodbye to you. In West Los Angeles, California, Doug. Hi, Doug. You're on with Matti Friedman and Dennis Prager.
Hi, Matti. Hi, Dennis. I read your piece, and it was incredible. But I had a question for you about Israeli newspapers. Haaretz seems to be as bad or worse than anything you described in your piece. Can you comment about that?
I think that's an excellent question. Haaretz, just for those who don't know, is a very important Israeli, I would say, liberal daily that is read by almost no one in Israel in terms of a segment of the newspaper market, but has a English edition that is probably the most influential source of news coming from Israel. Haaretz, I think, serves as, let's say that it has two roles. It has a role in Israeli society of being a very, very hard left voice, which I think is valuable as part of a more general conversation in Israel, which requires different kinds of voices. Abroad, it serves as a screen for people who hate Israel and want to be able to hide behind Jewish and Israeli voices. And I think that has come to be Haaretz's main role in the, quote, discussion, end quote, of Israel abroad. I think it's had an incredibly destructive and poisonous role in the debate about Israel abroad. Often voices saying the same thing can mean completely different things in different contexts. And Israeli voices taking part in an Israeli debate sound very, very different when they're translated into English and they pop up in America.
Yeah. By the way, I just for the record, I think people will find it of interest. I pay like anyone else would. I actually subscribe to Haaretz, the English edition, which is typical because we conservatives always read what the left writes and hear what they say. They never read us. They never hear us. We are so much more intellectually alive than the left. That is why in every instance I have confronted people of the left, it has not been fair. And I am easygoing. But they know none of our arguments. We know all of their arguments. There is no comparison in terms of intellectual openness. And it's symbolic that this conservative talk show host pays of his own money to subscribe to Haaretz, which, by the way, is absolutely left. It's the New York Times of Israel in every way, in prestige and in leftism. Let's go to another LA call as it happens. College Park, Maryland. All right, I missed by 3,000 miles. Rich in College Park, Maryland. Matti Friedman, Dennis Prager. Hi.
Hello, we're the Los Angeles of suburban Washington, D.C., but this is a spectacular program, and I want to take the last caller's question in a different direction. For the non-Israeli press, what does your guest think? Is there anybody out there in large wire services or other organizations that's doing things right?
Yeah, you have about 20 seconds.
Then I'll have to give the simple answer, no.
That's fascinating. Although you do say you're finding yourself reading the Wall Street Journal. But in terms of news as opposed to commentary, the world press has been terrible. Well, Matti, I hope this is not the last time we talk. Thank you for your piece. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'll be back, and I'll take your calls. I'm